Usually when you look at a photograph, there is this prevailing expectation of absolute, undeniable truth. It feels like you're looking through a perfectly clean window.
Right.
You just point the lens, the shutter clicks, and bam, you've captured reality exactly as it is, frozen in amber.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like objective evidence. We inherently trust the camera to be this completely impartial witness to the world.
It's a very comforting thought, honestly, especially for us as photographers, or really even just for anyone who consumes thousands of images a day. We like things to be literal.
Sure.
You see the image and you think, there it is, that happened. But when you actually dig into the history of how the camera evolved, that pristine window turns into something much more like a funhouse mirror. You realize you are looking at a technological landscape that is incredibly biased.
And that bias isn't necessarily a flaw in the lens or the sensor itself. It's actually baked right into the very reason the camera was invented in the first place.
Exactly. Okay, let's unpack this. Today we are taking you, the listener, the photographer, the visual consumer, on a comprehensive chapter-by-chapter journey through Gisèle Freund's absolutely seminal work, Photography and Society.
It's such a brilliant book.
It really is. We often think of photography as this purely technological invention, right? Like, we picture a lone genius in a lab mixing chemicals and boom, they invent the camera, and then that new piece of tech goes out and simply changes how society sees the world.
Right. The technology dictates the culture.
Yeah, but Freund argues the exact opposite. She says society created the camera. It was the rapidly changing social and economic structures in the 19th century that actively, almost magically, summoned photography into existence.
It is a total paradigm shift. I mean, Freud's core thesis is that artistic expression and social forms continually reshape each other. They're locked in this reciprocal dance. The camera is not just an impartial mechanical eye. It's a tool that inherently reflects the values, the desires, and the economic needs of the dominant social class of its time. To put it bluntly, the camera exists because a very specific group of people really needed it to exist.
Which means to really understand the birth of the photograph, we actually have to rewind the clock. Before we can even talk about lenses or silver Halide crystals, we have to understand the immense societal craving that made a mechanized image absolutely necessary.
Absolutely.
And that brings us to the rise of the bourgeoisie in the 18th century.
Right. So if we look at France around 1750, you have these nascent middle classes. So merchants, grocers, haberdashers, bureaucrats.
People who are actually making money.
Exactly. They're starting to accumulate wealth, and they are pushing into areas of society that had formerly been the exclusive domain of the aristocracy. And, one of the ultimate status symbols of the aristocracy was the portrait. For centuries, if you had power and land and wealth, you commissioned a master painter to capture your likeness. It was how you visually affirmed your status, how you proved your bloodline, and ultimately, how you secured your legacy.
But commissioning a master painter takes a massive amount of money, and it requires dozens of hours of sitting.
It's exhausting and expensive.
Right, and the rising middle class wanted that exact same status symbol. They wanted to project that same importance, but they simply didn't have the vast fortunes or the endless leisure time of a duke. So they needed the portrait to be cheaper, and they needed it to be faster. They basically needed to democratize the human face.
And the market responded to that specific economic demand. But, the first response wasn't actually a photograph. It was the silhouette.
I find this detail from Freund's research so fascinating. The word silhouette is actually named after a real person, right?
Okay.
A French finance minister named Monsieur de Silhouette. In the mid-1700s, France was basically careening toward bankruptcy.
Yeah.
And this finance minister levied all these severe public taxes and slashed government spending. He became incredibly unpopular, just an absolute symbol of aggressive penny pinching.
The public was so spiteful about him that they actually started wearing clothes without pockets.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the joke was, well, what was the point of having pockets if the finance minister was just going to take all your money anyway?
That is hilarious.
Right. So they called these cheap, stripped-down fashions a la silhouette.
And then that sarcastic nickname just kind of transferred over to these incredibly cheap, fast portraits that were becoming super popular on the streets of Paris.
Exactly.
An artisan would literally just cut black paper into the profile of your face. It was an abstract, insubstantial shadow of a person, the silhouette. But people absolutely flocked to it because it was fast, it was affordable, and it gave them a tiny piece of that aristocratic legacy.
But it still wasn't quite enough.
Right, because a black cutout doesn't show your features. It doesn't show the expensive fabric of your new coat.
Exactly. They wanted detail. They wanted a true likeness. Which brings us to a really crucial stepping stone in 1786 and a man named Gilles-Louis Chrétien.
So who was he?
Chrétien was an engraver, and he was really struggling to make a living because traditional miniature painting and engraving just took way too long to turn a meaningful profit.
You can't scale it.
Right. He realized he needed volume. To get volume, he needed speed. So he invented this mechanical device called the physionotrace.
I was trying to picture this thing while reading the source material. It sounds vaguely like a medieval torture device, but mechanically, it's essentially just a massive pantograph, right?
Exactly. For those who might not know, a pantograph is this mechanical linkage based on parallelograms. If you trace a line with a pointer on one end of the linkage, a pen on the other end perfectly copies that exact movement, usually at a scaled down size.
So you sit the model down in a chair. The operator sits behind this big, upright wooden apparatus, looking through a viewing eyepiece, and the operator literally traces the contours of the sitter's profile in the air. So their nose, their lips, their hair, using a stylus.
Right, and because of those parallelogram mechanics, a connected inked stylus automatically reproduces that exact design onto a piece of paper or a copper plate at a miniature scale.
Okay.
What's fascinating here is that the physionotrace is the direct ideological predecessor to the camera. It is the literal missing link between the painter and the photographer.
But hold on. If I think about a beautifully painted miniature portrait from that era, there is a master artist interpreting the soul of the subject. They're making choices about light, about expression, about mood.
Sure.
The physionotrace just mechanically traces physical lines. It feels like going from a master oil painter to like a modern shopping mall photo booth. You're completely sacrificing the artistic soul of the portrait for speed and affordability.
You really are.
So if the physionotrace was already mechanizing the human face back in the 1780s, was photography really a revolutionary leap? Or just the next logical hardware upgrade to this exact same machine?
It was absolutely just the next logical upgrade, and that is actually Freund's central argument. The physionotrace proved definitively that a massive market existed for mass mechanized portraiture.
Right.
Think about what Chrétien actually did. He stripped the artist's intuition, the subjective human interpretation, completely out of the portrait process. He replaced human empathy with mathematical, mechanical precision.
Wow.
You no longer had an artist evoking the spirit of the sitter, you just had a technician operating a machine. But the bourgeoisie loved it, it was cheap, it required only one short sitting, and it produced a highly accurate, albeit very stiff and frozen, likeness.
The source notes that the major physionotracists in Paris, guys like Chrétien, Quedati, and Gonor, they were making an absolute killing.
Oh,
They were tracing everyone from radical revolutionaries like Robespierre to royalty like Louis XVIII. And in the process, they basically completely put traditional miniature painters out of business.
They set the economic stage.
Yeah.
They proved that if you could mechanize the capture of reality, the rising middle class would just buy it in droves.
Yeah.
So the societal demand for exact, rapid, mechanized representation was fully established by the end of the 18th century. Society was practically screaming for the camera. It was literally just waiting for the chemistry to finally catch up to the mechanics.
And the chemistry finally does catch up, pushing us into the 1820s and 30s, and the actual birth of the photograph. Enter Joseph Nicephore Niepce.
Niepce is such a fascinating figure. He was this retired gentleman scientist living out in the French provinces.
Which was kind of a common thing back then, right?
Yeah, the post-revolutionary era left a lot of the former nobility and royalists totally excluded from political life, so they just retired to their country estates and tinkered with science, which was incredibly fashionable. Niepce was initially experimenting with lithography, which is a printing process, but he couldn't find the right quality of limestone locally. So he started experimenting with metal plates and light-sensitive chemicals instead.
Specifically, he was using a naturally occurring asphalt called bitumen of Judea coated onto a pewter plate. And in 1826, after years of failures, he creates the first primitive photographic process. He literally captures the view from his upstairs window.
Yes, the very first photograph.
But the chemistry is so incredibly slow that the exposure time took roughly 8 hours in direct sunlight. You can actually see the sunlight illuminating both sides of buildings in the final image. because the sun physically moved across the sky during the exposure.
I mean, it was a monumental scientific breakthrough, but Niepce was a terrible businessman.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he was secretive, he refused to publish his findings clearly, he spent his entire family fortune on these experiments, received zero public recognition, and tragically died totally impoverished in 1833.
But before he died, he formed a partnership with a man who was his exact opposite in every conceivable way. Louis Daguerre.
Yes.
Daguerre was not a quiet gentleman scientist. He was a theatrical painter. He was the inventor of a super popular Paris attraction called the diorama. And above all, he was a brilliant, cutthroat, ambitious entrepreneur.
Absolutely. So Daguerre takes Niepce's primitive bitumen process and completely overhauls the chemistry. He started using silver-plated copper sheets. He discovered that if you expose the silver plate to iodine vapor, it forms this light-sensitive coating of silver iodide.
Okay.
He also made a crucial, completely accidental discovery regarding latent images. He found that you didn't actually have to leave the plate in the camera until the image fully appeared.
Wait, really? How did he figure that out?
Well, the legend is he put an underexposed plate in a chemical cabinet and went to sleep. And the next morning, the image had appeared because of mercury fumes from a broken thermometer. So he realized you could expose it for a shorter time, creating an invisible or latent image, and then develop it later by exposing the plate to heated mercury vapor.
Eating mercury vapor to develop an image, I'm sure that was absolutely fantastic for his lungs.
Oh, it was incredibly toxic. I mean, terrible for you. But it worked. And finally, he figured out how to fix the image, meaning stop it from continuing to darken when you brought it out into the light by bathing it in a strong salt solution.
So he actually created the first truly practical photographic process.
Yes. And because he was a master marketer, he heavily branded it the daguerreotype, completely sidelining Niepce's contributions and ensuring his own name would echo through history forever.
But here's where the economics come back into play. Even Daguerre, with all his incredible salesmanship, couldn't find private investors to back the daguerreotype at first.
No, businessmen in the 1830s weren't into risky, unprecedented technological speculation. They wanted safe bets.
Right. So Daguerre executes his brilliant pivot. He turns to the government. And in 1839, we meet François Arago, who was a liberal politician and a highly respected scientist in the French Chamber of Deputies.
Arago is arguably one of the most crucial figures in the entire history of photography. He represented the intellectual, progressive, forward-thinking wing of the French bourgeoisie.
Okay.
He saw Daguerre's invention and instantly recognized its staggering potential. Arago goes to the French government and proposes something entirely unprecedented.
What does he do?
He convinces the state to buy the patent for the daguerreotype, grant Daguerre and Niepce's son lifelong pensions, and then just gift the technology to the entire world free of charge in order to accelerate human progress.
That is amazing. So August 19, 1839, the government officially makes the chemical process public at a joint meeting of the Academy of Sciences and the Academy of Fine Arts. The source text describes a literal riot outside the doors because the crowds of Parisians were so massive.
Oh, they were completely obsessed.
It triggered an immediate cultural phenomenon that they actually called daguerreotypomania. Suddenly, everyone in Paris who could afford the equipment went crazy, setting up these massive wooden boxes trying to capture images of monuments, bridges, and rooftops.
Yeah.
But if we're talking about portraiture, I have to point out that the reality of getting your portrait taken in 1839 sounds like absolute physical torture.
It was a horrific physical ordeal, truly.
We're talking about cameras that weighed up to 100 pounds. As a photographer, you had to prepare the silver plate in the dark with those highly dangerous toxic iodine vapors right before using it.
Right.
And for the subject, the exposure times were agonizing. At first, you had to sit for up to half an hour in direct, blinding sunlight. You had to sit completely, rigidly motionless, because if you blinked too much, your eyes would blur into terrifying empty sockets on the final plate.
To prevent that blurring, photographers used this terrifying heavy iron bracket called an appuie-tête.
An appuie-tête, what is that?
It was basically a medieval clamp attached to the back of the chair that locked your skull and your neck in place so you physically couldn't move your head.
So you're clamped into an iron brace. You're sweating profusely in the blazing summer sun. The sweat is streaking the thick white powder they intentionally painted onto your face to enhance the contrast for the primitive lens.
It sounds like a nightmare.
I mean, seriously, how did this process ever catch on? Why would anyone subject themselves to half an hour of clamped, sweaty agony just for a tiny picture on a piece of metal?
Because it provided something that human beings crave on a primal level: permanence. It speaks volumes about human vanity, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
The bourgeois desire for a literal, exact, undeniable legacy was so overpowering that people were entirely willing to endure physical agony to achieve it. A painting could be idealized, you know?
Right.
A painting could be dismissed as just the artist's flattery.
Right. Oh, the painter just made my nose look nicer.
Exactly. But the camera was seen as an infallible scientific instrument. A daguerreotype was undeniable proof of your existence, your wealth, your status. It was the ultimate validation of their newly won social position.
And Arago, to his credit, saw past the vanity. In his speech to the French government, he didn't just sell the camera as a fancy portrait tool for rich merchants.
No, Arago's foresight was breathtaking. In 1839, looking at a crude image on a silver plate, he predicted the camera would eventually be attached to telescopes to map the surface of the moon in astrophysics.
Wow.
He predicted it would be used by archaeologists to instantly copy millions of ancient hieroglyphics in Egypt, saving scholars decades of manual tracing. He saw the camera not as an artist's brush, but as the ultimate tool of objective scientific documentation.
That's incredibly visionary. And while Europe was going absolutely crazy for it, the craze absolutely exploded in America between 1840 and 1860. The source points out that the daguerreotype perfectly matched the American pioneer spirit in a way that almost no other technology did.
Yeah, think about the sociological makeup of the United States at that time. It was a young, aggressively expanding democracy shifting rapidly into an industrial powerhouse.
Right.
It was the era of the gold rush, of massive westward expansion, of manifest destiny. You had this exploding population of proud, self-made citizens who were intensely eager to document their own individual achievements.
They didn't have centuries of aristocratic ancestry to lean on.
Exactly. Their identity was built on what they were accomplishing right now.
And the photographers totally followed that demand. They were converting horse-drawn covered wagons into mobile daguerreotype studios, stocking them with toxic chemicals and heavy glass, and taking them across the Rocky Mountains to photograph miners, soldiers, and pioneers.
It's a huge logistical feat.
By 1850, Americans were spending millions of dollars a year on these portraits. It was a massive, decentralized industry. But for all its beauty, the daguerreotype had a fatal structural flaw.
It produced a single, unique, non-reproducible image directly on a metal plate.
Right. You couldn't make copies. If you wanted a portrait for your mother and one for your sister, you had to sit in that iron clamp twice. To truly become a mass-market capitalist industry, the technology had to evolve past the single plate.
Which brings us to the next massive chemical leap, the wet plate collodion process, which utilized glass negatives. Introduced in the early 1850s, this changed absolutely everything.
How so?
Well, you exposed a glass plate to create a negative image, and from that single glass negative, you could chemically print an infinite number of positive paper prints. This was the technological shift that made true mass production and mass distribution possible.
But right before mass production completely takes over, standardizes everything, and frankly ruins the soul of the medium, we get this beautiful, fleeting, miraculous window of time. We enter the golden age of the artist-photographer.
The 1840s and 50s in Paris. This is such a fascinating sociological pocket. During this brief window, photography is still technically demanding enough, messy enough, and expensive enough that it hasn't been completely industrialized into factories. And who steps in to master this new, messy medium? The Bohemians.
These are the proletarian intellectuals of Paris. We're talking about failed painters, struggling writers, radical journalists, and ironically, former miniature painters who just lost their jobs to the physionotrace and the daguerreotype.
Exactly.
They're essentially starving artists living in the Latin Quarter, entirely alienated from the wealthy conservative bourgeoisie, and out of sheer economic desperation, they turn to photography to pay the rent. The most famous, the absolute titan of these early artists, is Félix Tournesson, known to history simply as Nadar.
Nadar is a giant in the history of photography, not just for his images, but for his whole approach to the medium. He was a caricaturist, a radical journalist, a novelist, deeply embedded in this bohemian circle.
Okay.
In 1853, he opens a photography studio, and it almost instantly becomes the epicenter of the Parisian intellectual elite. He photographed everyone who mattered in the culture. The painter Eugène Delacroix, the poet Charles Baudelaire, the writer George Sand, the composer Rossini.
And his portraits are just stunning. If you look at a Nadar portrait today, it doesn't look like a stiff historical artifact. They are deeply intimate, incredibly modern psychological studies.
They really are.
Here's where it gets really interesting. I want to pause here because the source points out a masked, almost counterintuitive paradox. Are we actually saying that the absolute golden age of photographic artistry happened because the technology was clunky and the photographers were basically starving artists who had failed at traditional painting?
Yeah.
That seems totally backward. You'd think better tech would make better art.
It does seem backward, but that is precisely the paradox Freund highlights. Why were Nadar's portraits so psychologically profound? Because the technology was still relatively slow, and more importantly, because these early bohemian photographers weren't yet pressured by the market to churn out 100 cheap images an hour for random people off the street.
Yeah.
They had the luxury of time. Furthermore, they were photographing their friends. Nadar was collaborating deeply with his intellectual peers. There was a mutual respect and an intimacy that existed before the camera was even brought into the room.
Wait, hold on. You're telling me a long exposure time, which requires the subject to hold perfectly still, actually makes a better psychological portrait? Doesn't the person just look stiff and unnatural if they have to hold a pose for several minutes?
No, it actually works in the opposite direction. Think about modern photography. When a camera clicks in a fraction of a thousandth of a second, it captures a fleeting micro-expression.
Yeah.
Usually it's a fake, superficial smile that we flash specifically for the lens.
Right.
But when a subject has to sit still for several minutes for a wet plate collodion exposure, they physically cannot hold a fake smile. The muscles in the face relax. The artificial, socially constructed mask completely drops away.
Oh, wow. That makes total sense. They settle into their actual self.
Exactly. What the slow camera captured over those minutes was a layered, lived-in psychological state. Nadar wasn't looking for a quick grin. He was hunting for the profound essence of the person.
And crucially, his portraits were completely unretouched. He left in the deep wrinkles, the dark shadows under the eyes, the messy hair, the intense, sometimes melancholic gaze.
Yeah, he didn't hide anything.
He manipulated the lighting in his studio brilliantly, using stark contrast to highlight the structure of the face. He treated the camera as an exploratory tool to reveal inner character, not as a commercial tool to flatter the client's vanity.
Nadar was also just a wild, fearless innovator. He didn't just stay in his studio. He took the very first aerial photographs in human history.
I read about this. It's crazy.
He commissioned a massive hot air balloon, and he took his camera up over Paris. But because he was using the wet plate collodion process, the chemistry required the plate to be exposed and developed while it was literally still wet. If the collodion dried, it lost its sensitivity.
Right.
So Nadar couldn't just take the picture and develop it later on the ground. Oh my God, so what did he do?
He had to physically build a light-proof darkroom inside the woven wicker basket of the hot air balloon.
That is insane.
He's floating hundreds of feet above Paris, smelling like explosive ether, frantically pouring collodion over glass, dipping it in silver nitrate, rushing it into the camera, exposing the rooftops of Paris, and then rushing it back into the darkroom tent to develop it before the wind dried the plate out. It is a staggering feat of engineering and artistic dedication.
It's incredible. But, as we know all too well, pure, uncompromised art rarely pays the rent in a capitalist society.
It does not.
Yeah.
And to survive, the medium of photography had to adapt to the economic realities of mass capitalism. The Bohemian era was a beautiful anomaly. What comes next triggers the medium's first great artistic decline.
Right. Enter our next major historical figure, a man named André Adolphe Eugène Désiré. The year is 1854, and the industrialization of the human face has officially begun. Désiré was an incredibly shrewd, ruthless businessman. He looked at Nadar's beautiful, large-format, expensive portraits and realized that while they were art, they were entirely economically unscalable.
Because Nadar's is catering to a small elite.
Exactly. Désiré realized that to make real astronomical money, he had to tap into the massive, untapped market of the lower middle class. And to do that, he had to drastically drop the price of a portrait.
So he invents a format called the carte de visite. It was a small photograph mounted on thick paper, roughly the size of a standard calling card. But how does he make it so cheap? If glass plates and silver chemistry are expensive, how does he drop the price so drastically?
He fundamentally alters the mechanics of the camera itself. Désiré commissions a special camera equipped with multiple lenses, sometimes 4, sometimes 8 lenses on the front of a single box. Inside the camera, he uses a sliding mechanical plate holder.
Okay, walk me through how that works mechanically.
Imagine you have one large, expensive glass photographic plate. Instead of opening one lens and exposing the entire plate to a single image, Désiré's camera allowed him to expose just one quadrant of the glass at a time.
Ah,
He uncaps the top left lens, takes a picture, then he physically slides the plate holder over, uncaps the top right lens, and takes a different pose. He could instruct the client to stand, then sit, then put on a hat, exposing a different section of the same glass plate each time.
wow. So he gets 6 or 8 completely different poses on one single expensive piece of glass using only one session of chemical development.
Precisely. He effectively industrialized the negative. By mass-producing them this way, he dropped the price of a dozen portraits to 1/5 of what a single traditional portrait used to cost. It was an absolute revolution in pricing, efficiency, and accessibility.
But the spark that ignited this into a global explosion happened in 1859, and it involves a massive celebrity endorsement. The story goes that Emperor Napoleon III was leading the French army out of Paris, marching toward Italy for war. He is literally at the head of an army, and he abruptly halts the entire military procession, steps off his horse, walks into Disderi's studio, and demands to have his portrait taken.
Talk about an endorsement. You have tens of thousands of soldiers just standing around outside in the street, waiting while the Emperor of France gets his picture taken.
Incredible.
And once those images of the emperor were published and sold, carte de visite mania just swept the globe. Everyone had to have them. People started collecting them in special leather-bound albums.
Right.
You would trade pictures of yourself with your friends, your family, and you would buy mass-produced cards of celebrities, politicians, and royalty to put in the same album, visually elevating your own social standing by associating with them.
But to appeal to these paying masses, to get them through the door as fast as possible, Disderi completely changes the visual aesthetic of the photograph. He introduces all these ridiculous standardized theatrical props into the studio.
Oh, yes.
Fake Greek columns made of papier-mâché, heavy velvet curtains, ornate wooden pedestals, painted backdrops of romantic gardens.
Because the bourgeoisie didn't want to be photographed as they actually were. They wanted to be photographed as they wished to be seen. They wanted the trappings of aristocratic wealth, even if it was just a fake column in a studio.
Yeah.
And most devastatingly to the art form itself, Disderi heavily introduces the practice of aggressive negative retouching.
Because the bourgeois clients didn't want the raw, intense psychological truth of a Nadar portrait. They wanted to look flawless.
Exactly.
So Disderi employs an army of technicians who sit at slanted desks with tiny pencils, literally scratching and drawing directly onto the glass negatives. They would shave down a double chin, straighten a crooked nose, aggressively erase every wrinkle, and smooth out the skin until it looked like porcelain.
It was a total rejection of the camera's ability to capture truth in favor of capturing an idealized, standardized commercial product.
It makes me think immediately of an early Victorian version of an Instagram face filter. You walk into the studio, you lean on the fake column, you strike a pompous pose with your hand tucked into your waistcoat like Napoleon, and the photographer just smooths out all your human flaws in the darkroom.
That's a perfect analogy.
It prioritized a flawless, standardized aesthetic over genuine human character. If you look at an album of carte de visite, everyone ends up looking like the exact same stuffed shirt, projecting this rigid, generic dignity. It's the homogenization of the human face.
And this rapid standardization completely killed the true artist photographers. Brilliant, meticulous photographers like Gustave Legray and the Bisson brothers, who took these majestic, unretouched, large-format masterpieces that required immense skill and time. They literally went out of business.
Wow.
They refused to compromise their artistic integrity to mass-produce cheap, retouched little cards, so their wealthy clients abandoned them for the faster, cheaper option. They lost their financial backing and were forced to close their doors.
It's the classic eternal battle of art versus commerce, and commerce absolutely obliterates art. But even Disderi, the ruthless architect of this capitalist triumph, doesn't get a happy ending, does he?
No, it is a profoundly tragic historical irony. Disderi made unimaginable millions. At his peak, he was earning astronomical sums. He had luxurious apartments, stables full of thoroughbred horses. He was the toast of Paris society.
Right.
But the multi-lens method he invented was so purely mechanical, so devoid of any unique artistic skill, that it was incredibly easy to replicate. Hundreds of cutthroat competitors simply bought similar cameras and opened studios on every corner of Paris, basically undercutting his prices.
So the market just flooded.
The market became completely oversaturated. Disderi was entirely ruined by the very mass market competition he himself invented. He eventually lost everything, fled the country, and died blind and penniless in a public hospital in Nice.
Ruined by his own machine. a victim of the very industrialization he championed. But this sudden flood of cheap, retouched, mass-produced images onto the streets of Paris didn't just ruin individual photography businesses, right? It deeply, profoundly offended the traditional art world.
It absolutely did.
This explosion of visual mediocrity triggers a vicious, existential debate that dominated the 19th century. Does photography have a soul? Is it art, or is it just an industrial machine?
The backlash from the traditional artists was fierce, highly coordinated, and deeply philosophical. And the loudest, most scathing, most eloquent critic was the famous French poet Charles Baudelaire.
Baudelaire did not hold back for a second. He launched this blistering, venomous attack on the medium, famously calling photography a refuge for unsuccessful painters.
Ouch.
Yeah, he mocked the general public, calling them a foul society that narcissistically worships its own trivial image on a piece of metal. He declared that photography was an industrial disease that was destroying what was divine and imaginative in the human spirit.
The great Romantic painter Eugène Delacroix also weighed in heavily on the debate. Now, Delacroix is an interesting case because he actually used photography. He was a founding member of the French Photographic Society, and he used photographs as reference studies for his paintings.
Okay, so he wasn't totally against the tech.
No, but he fundamentally argued that a photograph is far too literal to ever be considered true art. He argued that the machine captures absolutely everything indiscriminately.
Yeah.
Every stray hair, every speck of dust, every awkward shadow, without the selective editing grace of the human spirit.
Right.
To the Delacroix, true art required a human mind to interpret, select, and elevate reality. The camera was just a dumb mirror.
On the other side of the ring, you had staunch defenders of the medium like the writer Francis Way, who argued that photography was actually a massive benefit to the art world. Way argued that it forced lazy academic painters to return to nature and literal truth instead of relying on tired mythological cliches. But I want to dig into Baudelaire's hatred for a moment. Was he just being an elitist, gatekeeping snob because poor working-class people could suddenly afford portraits? Or was he actually onto something profound about the danger of a society becoming obsessed with its own literal reflection?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Baudelaire was hitting on something much deeper than mere class snobbery. He was critiquing a prevailing 19th century philosophical movement called positivism.
Positivism.
Yes, championed by thinkers like Auguste Comte. Positivism was the belief that society should be based entirely on observable, literal, scientifically measurable facts. It rejected theology, it rejected metaphysics, and it rejected the unseen.
I see where this is going.
Baudelaire and the Romantics believed the exact opposite. They believed that art should be about subjective, spiritual interpretation, about the invisible realm of dreams, emotions, and the imagination. To them, photography was the ultimate, terrifying triumph of positivism. It threatened to reduce the profound magic of human reality to a mere mechanical inventory of measurable light and shadow.
That is a really fascinating philosophical angle. But let's be honest, we can't ignore the economics here either. The debate was also deeply rooted in financial panic.
Of course.
The traditional portrait painters, the miniaturists, the engravers, they were furious because this machine was literally stealing their livelihoods. It's very easy to develop a high-minded philosophical hatred for a machine that is starving your family.
Exactly. Economic survival very often dictates aesthetic philosophy. When your rent is due, the machine that takes your job is not just a technological shift, it is an enemy of the soul.
But while the elite Parisian art world was having this high-minded existential debate about whether the camera possessed a soul, the camera itself was quietly infiltrating another realm entirely. It was fundamentally changing how the general public consumed traditional art, and simultaneously the technology was rapidly mutating to become radically easier for the public to use. Let's talk about what Freund refers to as the museum without walls.
This is a monumental cultural shift. In the latter half of the 19th century, a photographer named Adolphe Braun begins using new, highly stable carbon printing techniques to mass reproduce masterworks of traditional art.
Okay.
He essentially industrialized the reproduction of genius. He sends teams of photographers to meticulously capture the frescoes of the Sistine Chapel, the sculptures of the Louvre, the paintings of the Uffizi.
And suddenly, the geographic and class barriers to art are completely shattered. You didn't have to be a wealthy aristocrat taking a grand tour of Europe to see a Michelangelo or Raphael.
Is it?
You could buy a high-quality, perfectly rendered photograph of it and study it in your living room in Paris or London or like a farmhouse in Ohio.
Exactly. Decades later, the French philosopher André Malraux looked back at this phenomenon and called it the musée imaginaire, the imaginary museum. Photography completely democratized art history. It created a universal visual language where a student anywhere in the world could study the masters.
That's amazing.
It is, but Malraux also pointed out a fascinating and somewhat dangerous side effect of this democratization. Photography inherently falsifies scale.
Oh, that is such a brilliant observation. If you look at a beautifully printed book of art photography, a tiny 2-inch ancient Roman coin can take up the exact same size on the page as a towering 20-foot marble statue of David.
Yes.
The camera completely strips the artwork of its physical context, its weight, and its monumental presence in a physical space.
It profoundly changed our entire psychological relationship to art history. We began to consume art not through physical bodily presence in a cathedral or a gallery, but through the flat, mediating lens of the camera. We became experts at looking at reproductions, not reality.
Wow.
And at the exact same time that the camera was changing how we viewed the masters, the camera itself was being put directly into the hands of the untrained masses.
1888, a watershed year in the history of human vision. George Eastman, an American entrepreneur, debuts the Kodak camera. And the marketing slogan he chooses is an absolute stroke of genius. You press the button, we do the rest.
It's iconic.
To understand how revolutionary the Kodak was, you have to understand the chemistry it replaced. Prior to this, even with dry gelatin plates, photography was largely for professionals or deeply dedicated amateurs who understood chemistry and exposure mechanics. The Kodak portable camera changed all of that.
Right, because it came preloaded with a revolutionary new medium, a roll of flexible, light-sensitive film that could hold 100 exposures.
And the user experience was entirely frictionless. You literally just pointed to the box, pressed a button, and wound the key.
Yeah.
You didn't focus it, you didn't mix chemicals, you didn't need a dark room. And when the roll of 100 shots was done, you mailed the entire physical camera back to the Eastman factory in Rochester, New York.
Yes.
They developed the negatives, put in the pictures, reloaded the camera with a fresh roll of film, and mailed it all back to you. It was the absolute birth of the amateur revolution.
It's so modern.
It reminds me exactly of the advent of the modern smartphone camera. Before the iPhone, you still needed some intent, some basic technical knowledge to carry a digital point-and-shoot camera around. But suddenly, the power to document reality is just effortlessly sitting in everyone's pocket.
Right, the barrier to entry drops to zero.
Anyone, regardless of skill, can be a photographer, which, historically, must have absolutely terrified the remaining professional portrait studio photographers.
Oh, they panicked completely. They saw this flood of casual, untrained snap shooters taking pictures of their dogs, their picnics, and their bicycles, and the professionals felt their hard-earned status slipping away. Desperate to separate their high art from the casual snapshots of the amateurs, professional photographers retreated into a movement called pictorialism.
And Freund is highly critical of this movement, right?
It's very critical. Pictorialists essentially tried to make their photographs look exactly like traditional paintings. They started using soft focus lenses to blur the image. They used heavy chemical manipulation in the darkroom. They would physically scratch the negatives, and they would print on highly textured paper.
Why?
All to make their photographs look like impressionist paintings or charcoal sketches. They were actively fighting against the camera's inherent sharpness.
Which is a massive artistic misstep. By trying to imitate painting, they were intentionally stripping photography of its greatest, most unique inherent strength.
Yeah.
Crystal clear, clarity, infinite detail, and literal objective representation.
Exactly.
They were fundamentally embarrassed to be photographers, so they pretended to be painters.
Precisely. They were fighting a losing battle against the nature of the machine. And meanwhile, the amateurs with their Kodak cameras were unknowingly creating an entirely new, massive social phenomenon, the picture postcard. As cameras became ubiquitous, the explosion of the photo postcard allowed ordinary, working-class people to actively project their social status across the globe.
Sending a postcard of yourself at the beach or standing in front of a famous monument basically communicated, look at me, I have the leisure time and the disposable income to travel and enjoy myself. It took personal, private leisure and turned it into a public, communicable, visual commodity.
So as cameras are becoming rapidly smaller, faster, and more ubiquitous, they inevitably move out of the controlled portrait studio, they move off the sunny tourist trails, and they hit the gritty, unpredictable reality of the streets. This brings us to a massive shift in the medium, the birth of photojournalism and the camera's awesome power to expose the truth.
And we see very early on in history that this power to expose is a razor-sharp double-edged sword. As early as 1871, during the Paris Commune, which was a radical working-class socialist uprising that briefly took over the city, photographers took these proud, defiant pictures of the revolutionaries standing boldly on the barricades they had built.
It was meant to document their triumph.
Right. But when the French army crushed the Commune weeks later, the police seized those exact same photographs, used them to identify the faces of the rebels, hunted them down, and executed them by firing squad. The camera acted as a lethal informer for the state.
It was a horrific realization that the camera is a weapon of surveillance and control. But conversely, as we move into the turn of the 20th century, the camera also becomes a vital weapon for social reformers. In the United States, you have pioneers like Jacob Riis in 1890 and Louis Hine in 1908.
Jacob Riis was a police reporter in New York City, and he was trying to write articles about the horrific, squalid conditions of the slum tenements on the Lower East Side. But words weren't enough.
No, they didn't have the impact.
So he utilizes a relatively new, highly dangerous invention, magnesium flash powder. He would sneak into these pitch-black, windowless tenement rooms at night, ignite a literal explosion of blinding flash powder, and capture the stark, horrifying reality of poverty.
And Louis Hine takes his camera directly into the massive industrial factories, mines, and textile mills to photograph young children, sometimes 6 or 7 years old, working 12-hour shifts in brutal, dangerous conditions.
And this is where the camera proves its undeniable power to force actual legislative change. You could read 100 pages of dry statistics about child labor, or read a politician's speech denying it happens.
Right.
But seeing a stark, unretouched photograph of a soot-covered 8-year-old girl missing fingers while working a textile loom that completely bypassed logic and hit the public directly in the heart, it provided undeniable, visceral evidence that led directly to the establishment of child labor laws.
It proved the camera was the ultimate, unblinking eyewitness. But the real evolution of how this visual news was delivered to the public happens later, in Germany in the 1920s.
What happened there?
The German illustrated press, specifically magazines like the Berliner Illustriert, pioneers something entirely new in publishing the photo essay.
Because before this era, newspapers and magazines just used a single photograph as an illustration, usually heavily cropped, just sitting next to a massive block of text. The text told the story. The photo was just a decoration.
Right, but the German editors realized the photographs could be the story itself.
And this editorial shift was made possible by brilliant photographers like Dr. Eric Salomon. Salomon utilized a new, incredibly compact camera called the Irminox.
The Irminox was revolutionary because it had a tremendously fast lens, an f1.8 lens, which, for photographers listening, allows an immense amount of light to hit the negative.
So Salomon didn't need to use that blinding, explosive flash powder. He could take candid photographs indoors using only the ambient light of a chandelier or a desk lamp.
Exactly.
Dr. Salomon was amazing. He was highly educated, spoke multiple languages, and he would put on a tuxedo, sneak into high-level, exclusive international diplomatic conferences, and take candid, unposed shots of the most powerful politicians in the world.
He caught them yawning, arguing, drinking, or looking utterly exhausted at 3 a.m. He completely stripped away the staged, formal, dignified facade of political power. He showed the public that these leaders were just tired, fallible men in suits.
But the crucial shift was how editors arranged these images. How did the transition from a single, static illustration to a multi-image photo essay actually change the way the public processed the news of the day?
It created a completely new visual grammar, didn't it? By arranging a sequence of candid photographs across a 2-page spread, sizing them differently for impact, the editors could tell a complex narrative purely through images.
Yeah.
The reader wasn't just intellectually reading about an event, they were forced into a visceral, emotional, almost cinematic encounter with it. It made the world feel immediate, accessible, and intimately human.
Exactly. And this highly dynamic German model of photojournalism quickly spread across the globe. It heavily influenced a man named Lucien Vogel in France, who created a groundbreaking magazine called Vue. And Vue ultimately served as the direct inspiration for Henry Luce in America to create Life magazine in 1936, which went on to dominate global media and dictate American visual culture for decades.
It's a huge lineage.
But this newfound absolute public trust in the camera as an infallible objective eyewitness created a very dangerous, deep-seated vulnerability in the global populace. Because people fundamentally believed that a photograph inherently equals the truth, they became incredibly easy to manipulate.
Yes.
And Gisèle Freund shares a brilliant, almost darkly comedic personal anecdote in the book about exactly this phenomenon.
It's a perfect illustration of her thesis. Freund was working as a photojournalist, and she was at the Paris Stock Exchange during a particularly chaotic day. She took a series of candid photos of a specific stockbroker. He's sweating profusely, his tie is undone, he's waving his arms frantically in the air, his face is completely contorted with intense emotion.
She sells the photos to an international photo agency and moves on. Sometime later, she sees her exact photos published in a major Belgian newspaper. Now, at this time, the Belgian economy was absolutely booming.
Right.
So the editors used her photos to illustrate a financial triumph. The caption beneath the photo read something like, "Rise in the stock exchange. Stocks reach fabulous prices." And when you look at the sweating, screaming broker with that caption in mind, he looks like a man shouting in absolute ecstatic victory, celebrating his massive wealth.
But then, shortly after, she finds the exact same photos published in a German newspaper. The German market was currently crashing into a severe depression.
Oh, no.
The German editors used her photos with the caption, "Panic at the Paris Stock Exchange. Fortunes collapse, thousands ruined." And suddenly, with that new context, the exact same sweating face, the exact same raised arms, looks like a man in the depths of agonizing suicidal despair.
So what does this all mean? It perfectly, terrifyingly illustrates Freund's ultimate warning. The meaning of a photograph is almost entirely dictated by its caption, its cropping, or its editorial context. The image itself, devoid of text, is entirely mute.
She also delves deeply into the heavy censorship and manipulation of images during World War II, which proves how thoroughly governments understood this psychological vulnerability.
Yeah.
And as the source historical text points out, both the Allies and the Axis heavily censored, manipulated, and strategically released photos to control public morale and dictate the narrative of the war. For example, American audiences were repeatedly shown the majestic, awe-inspiring photographs of the atomic mushroom cloud over Hiroshima, framing it entirely as a symbol of overwhelming scientific triumph and definitive victory.
Right, but they were purposely not shown the intimate, gruesome photographs of the burned civilian victims on the ground until long after the war ended.
Conversely, the German public was constantly fed heroic images of their soldiers, but was never shown photographs of the gas chambers or the systemic atrocities of the concentration camps while the war was ongoing. Both sides aggressively weaponized the editing and suppression of photography.
But wait, I have to stop and ask a fundamental question here. If a photograph is literally just a mechanical process, a digital sensor, or a chemical plate capturing the exact light waves bouncing off reality, how can we conceptually blame the camera for manipulation? Isn't it just the editors, the politicians, and the propagandists who are lying? The camera itself is completely innocent.
That is exactly Freund's point, though. The camera is innocent, but its innocence is exactly what makes it so dangerous. A photograph has no inherent moral truth. It is an empty vessel.
Wow.
It only reflects what the person holding the camera consciously chooses to frame, and more importantly, what the editor chooses to crop out or caption. The extreme danger lies in the fact that the public believes the camera is an objective, truth-telling machine. Governments, propagandists, and modern advertisers know full well that a photograph bypasses our critical, analytical logic and hits our emotional core directly. It is the ultimate tool for manipulation specifically because we trust it so blindly. We don't question a photo the way we question an editorial essay.
Which leads us perfectly into the final era of Freund's analysis, the modern gaze.
Yeah.
Because this incredible, unearned emotional power of the image inevitably leads to modern societal conflicts over privacy, exploitation, and the very ethics of seeing and being seen.
As photography becomes ubiquitous in the mid-20th century, we start seeing complex, unprecedented legal battles over who actually owns the context of a human face. There's a very famous foundational case involving the great French street photographer Robert Doisneau.
What happened there?
He took a candid, charming photo of a young woman having a glass of wine at a Parisian cafe, sitting with an older gentleman. He had asked their permission, they smiled, he took the shot. It was an innocent slice of life. But his photo agency later sold the image without his direct oversight, and it ended up being used by a cheap scandal magazine to illustrate a lurid expose on prostitution and alcoholism in Paris.
The young woman in the photo sued the magazine and the agency, completely understandably. Her reputation was ruined by a caption. It proves that once your image is captured by a lens, it is detached from your reality. You completely lose control over what story your face tells the world.
And this ruthless exploitation of the human image reaches an absolute fever pitch in the 1950s with the rise of the paparazzi in Italy.
Right.
The paparazzis were feeding a massive, exploding scandal press that emerged in the post-war economic boom. The public, suddenly flush with disposable income and leisure time, developed this insatiable, voyeuristic desire for celebrity culture. To get the lucrative shots, the paparazzi started utilizing extreme telephoto lenses.
And the history of these lenses is telling, right? They had actually been developed and refined during World War II for the military, specifically to allow reconnaissance planes to safely spy on enemy coastlines and troop movements from miles away.
Yes.
So it is literal weaponized visibility. You're taking a piece of optical technology explicitly meant to spot enemy tanks, and you're using it to hunt down actresses, politicians, and princesses lounging by their private pools in the Mediterranean. It completely shatters the historical boundary between public and private life. The camera allows the public to invade the private sanctuary of the individual.
This raises an important question for society. What are the ethics of the camera? Has this machine fundamentally altered our morality alongside our vision? Are we complicit in this invasion every time we buy the magazine or click the link?
But despite the paparazzi, despite the state propaganda, despite the Instagram-style retouching that started with this dairy, Freund points out that true elevated photographic art does survive into the modern era. And it survives by finally confidently embracing what it actually is, rather than pretending to be something else.
Right. In 1925, the Bauhaus artist Laszlo Moholy-Nagy introduced a critical concept he called the new vision.
What was his argument?
Moholy-Nagy argued that photography needed to finally stop being embarrassed of its mechanical nature. It needed to stop trying to imitate the soft brushstrokes of romantic painting. The camera is a machine, and it has its own unique, beautiful laws of light, space, and optical perspective.
Yeah.
It can capture the violent motion of a speeding train in a blur. It can use strobe lights to freeze a bullet in midair. It can look straight down from a towering skyscraper or shoot straight up from a gutter in ways the human neck and eye simply cannot physically do.
Yeah. He realized that the camera doesn't just record the world. It fundamentally changes human vision. We no longer see the world exclusively with the organic naked eye. Our reality is entirely mediated by the lens.
Exactly.
The camera has taught us how to conceptualize the world in extreme close-ups, in distorted wide angles, in slow motion, in microscopic detail. It didn't just record the history of our society. It completely rewired the neurology of our brains. We think in photographs now.
And that ultimately is the grand takeaway from Gisèle Freund's lifetime of work.
Okay, let's bring this all together. We've gone on an incredible, sprawling journey today through the history of human vision. We started the 18th century with the physionotrace and the bourgeoisie's desperate economic desire for cheap status symbols.
We suffered through the agonizing, sun-baked iron head clamps of the early daguerreotypes.
We saw the bohemians, like Nadar, find deep psychological art in clunky, slow technology. And we saw Gisèle kill that art with multiple lenses, aggressive retouching, and mass production.
We watched the Kodak camera democratize the image, taking it out of the studio and putting the power in everyone's hands, while simultaneously turning art into cheap postcards.
We saw the camera expose horrific child labor and slum conditions with blinding flash powder, acting as a heroic societal eyewitness. But we also saw it twisted into a lethal tool for state surveillance and wartime propaganda.
It becomes incredibly clear that photography isn't just a chemical reaction on a glass plate, and it isn't just a digital sensor gathering pixels. It is a mirror.
Yeah.
It is a mirror reflecting the exact economic needs, the vanities, the political struggles, and the profound social values of whatever era happens to be holding the lens. The society builds the exact camera it needs.
I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over as you go about your day. Today, in our modern, hyper-connected world, we generate billions upon billions of digital images every single day.
It's an unfathomable number.
The vast, overwhelming majority of these photos are never printed on paper. They live on remote servers, they are swiped past on glowing screens for 2 seconds, and they are instantly forgotten, buried in an endless algorithmic feed.
Right.
If 19th century photography was born out of a desperate, primal desire to preserve memory, fight mortality, and establish a permanent social legacy, what does our modern obsession with ephemeral, instantly disposable, heavily filtered images say about our current society's relationship with time, with attention, and with truth?
Wow. If the early clamped-in portraits were about fighting mortality and proving you mattered, maybe our endless digital snaps are just about proving we existed for a fleeting, desperate second in the feed before vanishing again.
Something to think deeply about the next time you point your smartphone lens at a perfectly staged plate of food or a sunset. Remember that funhouse mirror we talked about at the very beginning? Every single time you tap that shutter button, you aren't just capturing the world in front of you. You are actively reflecting the hidden architecture of the society you live in. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep exploring, keep questioning the media you consume, and start looking at the thousands of photographs around you with a much more critical, historical eye.